the de Havilland Mosquito should not have worked. In 1938, by normal military thinking, Geoffrey de Havilland's idea sounded crazy. A bomber made almost all from wood. No defensive guns. It would survive only by being fast. The Air Ministry's answer was what you would expect. A polite no. Metal was the future. Wood was from the last war. Wood was for making biplanes with fabric and canvas, not for an air force getting ready to fight the machine power of Nazi Germany. But de Havilland did not give up, and because he did not give up, one of the most elegant aircraft of the war was born, and the stage was set for an unlikely hero who would make it even faster. Still, Britain in the late 1930s had a hard numbers problem. The military was building up again. It needed planes fast. But aluminum was rare. It was rationed. Every branch of the force was fighting to get it for their fighters and bombers. De Havilland's genius was seeing a chance where others only saw a limit. His company had spent years perfecting layered wood construction. They bonded birch plywood with Ecuadorian balsa and Canadian spruce using casein glues first made for furniture. These methods made structures that were light, strong, and, most important, easy to build in normal workshops. Furniture makers and piano factories could build them. These workers had skills, but they were not allowed to work on metal airframes. The Mosquito would be a war machine, but it would be built by peacetime craftsmen. It would be a bomber that did not steal supplies from Spitfire production. The design that came out in 1939 was bold. 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. These were the same engines that powered Hurricanes and Spitfires. They were mounted on a sleek body with a wingspan of 16.5 meters. There were no gun turrets. There was no bomb aimer's compartment. There were only 2 people in a tight cockpit, the pilot and the navigator. They were betting their lives on math. The early performance numbers promised something amazing. A top speed of more than 400 miles per hour at high altitude. That was faster than any fighter flying at that time. Speed as armor. Speed as weapon. The first prototype was painted training yellow. It took off from Hatfield Aerodrome on 25th of November 1940. The test pilot, Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., pushed the throttles forward, and the Mosquito did something no one expected. It felt eager. By February 1941, official tests at Boscombe Down showed that the numbers were not a dream. At 22,000 feet, the plane reached 392 miles per hour. And this was only a prototype. It was heavy with test equipment. The engines were not even tuned yet. The Air Ministry started to change its mind, but speed on paper and speed in battle are not the same thing. The Merlin XX engines in the early Mosquitoes were set for certain boost pressures. 14 pounds per square inch for takeoff. Less than that for long cruise. These limits were not random. Rolls-Royce engineers had calculated things like detonation margins, bearing temperatures, and piston crown stress. If you pushed the engine harder than the limit, the risk was huge. You could get shattered rods, melted pistons, or engines ripping themselves apart at 20,000 feet over enemy land. The manuals were very clear. The limits were sacred. But by late 1942, when Mosquito crews began flying deep into Germany, they reported a problem. The planes were fast, yes, but not always fast enough. The Luftwaffe's Focke-Wulf 190 and the newest Messerschmitt 109G versions were getting closer and closer. Enemy fighters were catching up more often than before. A Mosquito jumping over the Ruhr might outrun a fighter chasing it, but the safe gap was getting thinner. Pilots started coming back with scary stories. Tracer bullets passing too close, dives that barely opened up the distance, engines howling at emergency power and still not giving quite enough. The Mosquito had proved that de Havilland's idea worked, but now it needed something extra, something the design team did not plan for, something the manuals did not allow. It needed someone who could look at the "do not cross" line in the engineering book and see a door instead of a wall. It needed someone who understood that rules made in peacetime might not survive what war demands. Roderick Banks was not supposed to change anything. He was a fitter, not an engineer. In 1942, the Royal Air Force took that difference very seriously. His workshop at RAF Marham in Norfolk was one of many across Bomber Command. They kept the Merlin engines alive. These engines powered Lancasters, Halifaxes, and more Mosquitoes. His job was to follow orders, not invent new ideas.
Take the engine apart.
Check each part. Replace anything worn out. Put it back together by the book. Sign the log. Send it back to the squadron. The whole system worked because men like Banks followed the rules exactly. Except Banks had a habit. He read everything. He did not just read the normal maintenance manuals. He also read the engineering documents that Rolls-Royce sent with the engines. Most fitters ignored those. They were full of math about heat and metal and pressure. Banks read them during meal breaks. He followed the logic behind boost limits and fuel mix ratios. He had joined the Rolls-Royce factory in Derby as an apprentice in 1935. He spent 4 years watching the Merlin engine being developed before the RAF brought him in. He understood these engines better than most people with sergeant stripes ever would. In early 1943, Banks noticed something. The Merlin manual gave the maximum boost pressures, but the deeper engineering data showed that the parts could maybe handle a little more.
Not a lot more,
but enough to matter. The limit was not truly about what the metal could survive. It was about what Rolls-Royce could safely promise for thousands of engines in all kinds of conditions. It was a safety margin. Banks began to wonder what would happen if you carefully ate into that margin. Just a little, but only on engines you knew were in perfect condition. The math was tempting. The Merlin's power depended directly on manifold pressure. That is, the boost pushing air and fuel into the cylinders. If you increase boost by 2 pounds per square inch, you could get about 100 more horsepower. In a Mosquito, that might mean around 15 more miles per hour at altitude. That could be the difference between getting away and getting killed. But it was not that simple. If you pushed too much boost through an engine, detonation would happen. That means the fuel-air mix explodes too early. That shock hits the pistons like a hammer and can crack metal in seconds. The Merlin used 100-octane fuel, which was better at stopping detonation than weaker fuels, but even that was not magic. Banks realized the safety margin depended on the exact fuel mix. If the mix ran too lean, that means too much air and not enough fuel, the cylinder would run too hot. If it ran too rich, meaning too much fuel, you lost the benefit. The perfect balance was tight, and it changed with altitude and throttle setting. Banks started small. He chose one engine that was already due for overhaul. That engine became his test bed. He adjusted the boost control unit. It sounded like a small change, but it was not small. He moved the overboost cutoff up by 2, then he made the fuel mix a little richer at high power settings. That extra fuel helped cool the engine, because fuel can absorb heat when it evaporates. On the ground test stand, the engine roared at pressures the Rolls-Royce manuals said were for emergency only. But this time it stayed there for minutes, not just seconds. The temperatures went up, yes, but they stayed in the safe range.
Nothing exploded. Nothing melted. The proof was one thing.
Getting someone to put this change into a real, combat-ready aircraft was another thing completely. RAF engineering officers were terrified of any change that was not approved. Every change needed paperwork.
And review, and signatures, and safety checks, and more paperwork.
Banks's idea lived in a grey zone. It was not exactly illegal, but it was for sure not approved. He needed someone who would take a risk on him, someone who would bet their name and their airplane on what a fitter said. He found that person in squadron leader Peter Channer. Channer was a Mosquito pilot. He had survived 3 tours. He did not have much patience for slow, careful thinking that got people killed. Channer had flown a mission over Cologne in February 1943. A 109G had almost caught him on the way out. It got so close he could see the German pilot's oxygen mask. That memory stayed with him. So when Banks explained what he had found, Channer listened. Channer's answer was simple. If it works, it's not illegal. It's initiative. If it fails, Banks takes the blame. They chose a Friday evening when the station engineering officer was not around. Banks and two riggers he trusted stayed up all night. They changed the boost controls and the fuel system on Channa's Mosquito. The plane's serial number was DZ414. By morning, the plane sat on the field like any other Mosquito.
Nothing on the outside gave it away. Only the logbook told the truth.
And even there, Banks wrote it very carefully. Fuel mixture optimization, routine adjustment. The Merlin engine's boost control system was simpler than most people thought. That made Banks's changes possible. It also made them dangerous. At its heart was a barometric capsule. That was a sealed metal bellows that reacted to air pressure. When the Mosquito climbed and the air got thinner, the capsule expanded. This made a mechanical change that reduced the maximum boost, so the engine would not overstress in thin air. Rolls-Royce had set these capsules to be safe, very safe. They assumed pilots might slam the throttles too hard in a fight. They assumed fuel quality might change. They assumed maintenance might not be perfect. Banks's first change was to that setting. Inside the boost control unit, a spring controlled how much pressure the capsule would allow before it cut power. Banks replaced that spring with one that was just a little softer. Not by a lot, just a little more forgiving. That change moved the maximum boost from 18 pounds per square inch to 20. 2 pounds does not sound huge, but at 20,000 feet, it meant the difference between 380 and 395 miles per hour. In chasing geometry, that gap could pull you from inside enemy gun range to safe in under 3 minutes. The fuel mix change was trickier. The Merlin's carburetor sent fuel through tiny jets. These were little brass holes drilled to exact sizes. Altitude and throttle position decided which jets were used. Rolls-Royce had set them to run a little lean at high power. That saved fuel and stopped spark plugs from getting dirty with carbon. But Banks realized this also meant less cooling. When you pull out full power, that extra fuel isn't just for burning. It also cools the cylinder by evaporating and pulling heat away. That keeps the aluminum pistons from getting too hot. To fix this, Banks swapped the main jet for one that was 1 drill size larger. That pushed fuel flow up by about 8% at full throttle. It was not so much that it drowned the engine or wasted a lot of fuel, but it was enough to drop exhaust gas temperature by 40 degrees Celsius. A temperature drop meant survival. Detonation and pre-ignition, the things that kill engines, happen when cylinder temperatures go past a certain point. Banks was buying heat safety. He also changed the magneto timing. The Merlin fired the spark plugs before the piston hit the top of its stroke. This gave the fire time to spread through the fuel and air mix. Rolls-Royce had set that at 15 degrees before top dead center. That was a balance between getting good power and not hurting the engine. Banks moved it to 18 degrees. This got more energy from each burn, but it also put more stress on parts like the rods and crankshaft. Banks decided the Merlin's lower end, meaning the crankcase and bearings, could take it, but only if the engine was in perfect shape. Worn bearings or slightly misshaped cylinders would blow up under that extra load. That is why Banks chose which engines to modify with extreme care. If an engine showed even a little wear, he put it back to normal spec.
Only engines fresh from overhaul got the special treatment. New pistons.
Bearings checked to within 1/1000th of an inch. Compression readings the same across all 12 cylinders. Those engines got the upgrade. He was pushing the edge. But he was not ignoring physics. The changes broke no exact written rule, because no written rule imagined them. RAF maintenance rules assumed that fitters would do only what the maker said. The rulebook did not say, you must not change the boost control. It just never thought anyone would. Banks worked in the quiet space between you are allowed and you are forbidden. That grey space where brave ideas live next to career-ending mistakes. Rolls-Royce's official position,
If they had known, would have been horror.
their warranty said clearly that if the engine was run past limits, the warranty was void. The company had tested engines until they blew up. They wrote down when pistons melted, when bearings seized, when crankshafts twisted apart. The safety margins existed because engines blowing up in the air meant dead air crew. Dead air crew meant investigations. Investigations meant blame. But Rolls-Royce was not the one flying over the Ruhr with Focke-Wulf fighters trying to line up a shot. Banks was betting that short bursts at higher boost, in minutes not hours, would not cause the failures Rolls-Royce feared. He was also betting on the 100-octane fuel's resistance to detonation. And he was betting on his own eye for picking only the best engines. And on riggers who would watch temperatures like their lives depended on it during flight tests. The morning after Banks modified DZ-414, Peter Channer took the Mosquito up alone. Standard test plan. Climb to 15,000 feet. Level flight at cruise power. Then the real test. Channer pushed the throttles all the way forward and watched the boost gauges go past the red line. The needles settled at 20. The Merlin's sound got deeper,
more urgent.
The plane's airspeed indicator went past numbers Channer had never seen in level flight. The proof came over Gelsenkirchen on 19th April 1943, squadron leader. Channer's crew had been sent on a daytime photo mission. They had to take pictures of synthetic oil plants in the Ruhr Valley. This kind of mission always pulled the attention of every Luftwaffe controller for miles. The Mosquito crossed the Dutch coast at 24,000 feet.
Cameras warmed up.
Channer's navigator called out landmarks over the intercom. Clear skies, perfect visibility. Terrible for staying hidden. The German fighters showed up 18 minutes after entering enemy airspace. Two Focke-Wulf 190 A5s were climbing hard from an airfield near Münster. Their BMW radial engines were working to gain height. The German ground controllers had done good work. They placed the fighters ahead of the Mosquito's path. They were cutting off the escape route back to the North Sea. Channer saw them at 6 miles, 2 dark dots against white clouds turning in to attack. This was normal Luftwaffe style. Get above and behind, dive fast. Use the speed from the dive. Fire 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns. Channer did not panic. He finished the photo run. He let the cameras do their job while the FW-190s closed the distance. Then he quietly said to his navigator, "Let's see what Banks gave us." The throttles were already at max, but now Channer used the override. He pushed them past the stops into the zone the Rolls-Royce books called emergency only. The boost gauges jumped to 20 pounds.
Then a little more.
The Merlin engines gave off a hard snarl that Channer could feel through the frame of the plane. The Mosquito jumped forward like it had been kicked. Channer felt it in his body. This was not a slow, steady build of speed. It was more sudden than that. The airspeed climbed past 400 miles per hour. Still rising, the altimeter began to unwind even though the throttles were wide open. They were trading height for speed in a shallow descent. The Mosquito held its energy while pulling away. The lead FW-190 pilot understood what was going on. He pushed his own plane into a steeper dive to try to keep up. For 30 seconds he held his range. Maybe he even got a little closer. Then the gap began to stretch. 500 yards became 600. Then 700. The Focke-Wulf was fast in a dive. It could hit almost 430 miles per hour, straight down. But it could not stay that fast in level flight. The Mosquito could. Channer watched the German fighters fall behind. The German pilots were no doubt pushing their own throttles to the limit, trying to get everything their engines could give. It did not matter. At 800 yards, which was outside good gun range, the FW-190s broke off. Channer kept full power for another 3 minutes. He crossed back into friendly airspace over the Scheldt estuary before finally easing the throttles back. The Merlin engines dropped to cruise. The temperatures were high but still safe. Both engines had lived. More importantly, so had he. The intelligence officer who interviewed Channer after the mission wrote it down in a calm way. Successfully evaded 2 FW-190s through speed advantage. The report did not show how important that moment really was. This was not luck. It was not a trick. It was physics. The Luftwaffe's top fighter, built to kill Allied bombers, had just been outrun in level flight by a wooden plane that should have been easy prey. News spread through Mosquito squadrons the way only truly useful news spreads. Other pilots started asking Channa questions, and Channa sent them to Banks with a certain look. By May, 3 more Mosquitoes at Marham had been modified. By June, Banks was spending his evenings working on engines from other squadrons. His workshop was slowly becoming an unofficial performance centre. The changes were still not officially allowed, but more and more station commanders were letting them happen anyway. They cared more about bringing their crews back alive than about perfect paperwork. The combat reports kept coming in through the summer of 1943. On 17th of June, a modified Mosquito outran 3 Messerschmitt 109 G6s over Hamburg. On 3rd July, another Mosquito escaped from a hard chase by Kurt Bühlegen's aircraft. Bühlegen was an ace with 112 victories. He knew exactly how to trap and kill. He still could not catch the Mosquito. On 22nd August, one Mosquito crew was trying to get home on only one working engine after flak damage. They used Banks's changes on the one good Merlin to stay ahead of 2 109s that should have easily finished them. They made it back. The numbers became clear. Mosquitoes with modified engines were coming home from missions that normal planes did not survive. The loss rate for planes with Banks's work was less than half of the normal Mosquito loss rate on the same kinds of missions. Staying alive gave crews more time in the air. More time in the air made them more experienced. More experience led to better bombing. It was a good cycle. Operation Jericho needed a level of accuracy that felt almost like suicide. The Amiens prison in northern France held 120 members of the French resistance. The Gestapo had planned to execute them on 19th of February 1944. London got desperate messages through SOE networks. Break the walls.
Give them a chance to escape.
If not, they will die. The job was for Mosquitoes to drop 500-pound bombs on a 3-story prison building. They had to break certain walls, but they could not destroy the whole place and crush the prisoners inside. It had to be a low-level attack in full daylight, about 300 miles into enemy land, then fly back through alert defences. Group Captain Percy Pickard took command. He chose crews from 140 Wing. These were experienced men who had already flown to Oslo, Berlin, and other targets that sounded impossible. Planning took 4 days. Photo reconnaissance gave them a detailed map of the prison grounds. The outer walls were 2 feet thick. Guard barracks sat next to the main building. German quarters were placed so they needed to be destroyed. French sections needed to stay standing, at least in theory. The bombing had to happen at rooftop height, maybe 50 feet. That meant the blast from your own bombs could break your own plane if your timing was even a little off. 19 Mosquitoes took off from RAF Hendon on the morning of 18th of February. The execution date had been moved earlier. The formation flew just above the waves across the English Channel. Navigation was done by stopwatch and compass. They reached Amiens at exactly 12:03. Pickard's plane led the first wave. 6 Mosquitoes climbed to 150 feet for their attack runs. The bombs hit perfectly. They blew open parts of the outer wall. They broke through the eastern wall near the cells of the prisoners marked for death. The second wave hit the guard buildings. Those bombs collapsed the German quarters and caused chaos. The third wave stayed in reserve, circling, but did not have to strike. Intelligence later said that 258 prisoners got out in the confusion, including most who were set to be executed. But getting the walls open was only the first danger. The bombing happened at noon. German radar stations were fully awake. While the Mosquitoes were turning for home, Luftwaffe controllers sent every fighter they could from airfields between Amiens and the coast. The British planes would have to survive 40 minutes of exposure before reaching the Channel, and they were flying over land filled with German army units. Every road had troops with radios. Pickard's Mosquito did not make it back. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s caught him near Beauvais. Their guns hit him before he could escape. Pickard and his navigator died right away. 2 other Mosquitoes were also shot down by fighters in those deadly minutes after the attack. They paid the price for needing to fly straight and level during the bombing. The other 16 planes survived mostly because of the modifications that Banks had now made standard. Squadron leader Ian McCritchie led the second wave. 4 FW-190s climbed to stop him near Abbeville. His modified Merlin engines gave him the extra 10 miles per hour that changed a possible dogfight into a race he could win. The German pilots fired from far range. Their 20mm rounds dropped behind McCritchie's tail as he pulled away. Flight Lieutenant Bob Aest faced an even longer chase. A 109 G6 jumped him from cloud cover south of Amiens. The German pilot flew the perfect attack that should have ended with Aest's Mosquito smashed across a French field. Aest shoved the throttles forward. He felt the engine note change as the boost pressure climbed into Banks's modified range. The 109 stayed behind him at first. The Gustav version was strong in level flight. It could do about 390 miles per hour at low altitude, but can do and can keep doing are different things. The Messerschmitt's Daimler-Benz engine also had limits. Just like the Merlin, going past those limits too long could wreck the engine. For 3 minutes, both planes tore across Picardy at full power. The 109 held position about 600 yards behind Aest's tail, close enough to scare him.
Too far to kill him.
Then slowly the distance grew.
Not by a lot at once.
This was not the huge burst that Channer felt up high. At low level, the thick air cut performance for both planes, but Aest's Mosquito held 405 miles per hour. The 109 could only hold 395, 10 miles per hour, added up over 3 minutes, turned into half a mile of space. The German pilot fired one more burst from too far away, then broke off. He was probably low on fuel. 12 of the Mosquitoes flying home that day had Banks's modifications. All 12 got back. The 4 that were lost included Pickard's unmodified aircraft and 3 others flying standard engines. The sample size was small. The math was not perfect. But the aircrews did not care about perfect math. They believed what they saw. By March, Banks was getting requests from squadrons he had never even heard of. Engineering officers were starting to look the other way on purpose. They did not want to stop this work. Even if they could not officially admit it was happening, Hermann Göring's anger was becoming famous, even for him. On 8 March 1944, during a meeting at Carenhall, he cut off a Luftwaffe technical report. He demanded to know why German fighters could not catch British wooden furniture. The Reichsmarshal's rage made sense. Mosquitoes were now flying over Berlin in daytime. They were taking pictures of Hitler's offices while Bf-109s scrambled below and failed to catch them. The embarrassment was not just military, it was personal. Göring had promised Hitler control of the skies. Instead, light wooden bombers were flashing over the capital at 400 miles per hour, and nobody could stop them. The Luftwaffe's answer showed how desperate they were. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf both got urgent orders. Get more speed out of what we already have. The engineers knew the shape of the problem. A Mosquito up high with good crew flew in a part of the performance map their fighters could almost reach, but not quite. Close. Annoyingly close. But war is not about almost. Messerschmitt's fix was the Bf-109 G10. It had a Daimler-Benz DB605D engine with better supercharging and emergency boost. That pushed output to 2,000 horsepower.
On paper, that sounded amazing.
In reality, the upgrades added weight, which cancelled some of the gain. The G10 could reach 426 miles per hour at the best height, but only for a short time, and only if the pilot was willing to burn up the engine's life in hours instead of days. German supply could not afford that across whole squadrons. Focke-Wulf worked on the T-152. This was Kurt Tank's intense remake of the FW-190 design. It had longer wings, a pressurized cockpit, and a Jumo 213 engine that made 2,050 horsepower with MW-50 methanol water injection. The test models hit amazing numbers, 472 miles per hour at 41,000 feet. That kind of altitude and speed should have crushed Mosquito missions. But building it took time that Germany did not have. The first TAR-152s reached squadrons in January 1945. That was too late. There were too few. They could not change the big picture. The Luftwaffe also tried copying Banks's trick. Some fighter units tried pushing boost limits on their DB605 and BMW 801 engines, hoping for the same safety margin British pilots seemed to have. The results were awful. German engines did not match the Merlin's toughness. By 1944, German factories were under bombing. Work had been split up into small shops. Forced labor with mixed skill levels was used. Alloys were swapped for lower quality metals. That meant the parts were weaker. Bearings failed. Pistons cracked. Connecting rods tore through crankcases. Sometimes a Bf-109 blew apart over its own runway because the pilot had asked for too much. These became do not do this lessons. The real problem was not just design. It was the whole war industry. Rolls-Royce's factories in Derby and Crewe still had steady material quality and highly skilled workers. Their supply lines were still working. German engine production by 1944 was full of shortages. They had to use bad materials. Tolerances got sloppy. Quality checks became mostly words on paper. An engine might look fine on the test stand, but still hide a weakness that would only show up under stress. Oberst Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, understood this very clearly. In April 1944, he wrote a memo to Göring. He said that even when German fighters did catch mosquitoes, the mosquitoes often got away by keeping high speed for long periods. He said German fighters could not match that speed for that long without risking the engine blowing up. He asked to move fighters away from less important areas and put them in thicker groups along mosquito routes. He said they should accept losses in other places so they could finally get solid kills on mosquitoes. Göring said no. The Reichsmarshal still believed there had to be a technical fix. He believed German engineering greatness, which Nazi ideology treated like a fact, would deliver a wonder plane to beat British plywood. He pushed more resources toward jet fighter work. The Me-262 jets were fast enough to catch a mosquito, but they arrived in tiny numbers when Germany needed hundreds. The pilots were rushed through training. The jets used fuel Germany barely had. Meanwhile, mosquito missions only grew. The fast bombers hit targets in daytime that heavy bombers would only attack at night. Ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, V-weapons sites along the French coast, Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen. The mental impact was huge. People in Germany watched mosquitoes fly overhead in the open, untouched by flak or fighters. They understood that the Luftwaffe no longer controlled the sky. Some Luftwaffe pilots began to respect the mosquito, even if they hated it. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, a veteran with 33 victories, wrote in his diary after he failed to catch one, "The Tommy flew like the devil was behind him." He did not know about Banks's changes. He did not know about higher boost limits and richer fuel mixes. But he could feel that something extra was happening. By autumn 1944, Banks's workshop at Marham had become half legend and half emergency service. Crews came from other stations. They brought bottles of whiskey and mechanical problems. They hoped the sergeant with the magic touch would look at their Merlin. Banks helped when he had time, but the need kept growing. One person could not keep up with it. The answer formed on its own. He started training others. He passed his methods to fitters who showed both good skill and the right kind of silence. The network grew carefully. Banks picked people by recommendation. He liked mechanics who had worked at Rolls-Royce factories or who had shown unusual initiative. He invited them to watch while he modified an engine. He explained the theory while his hands did the work. The boost control change, the fuel jet swap, the magneto timing advance. He showed each step twice. Then the student did it with him watching. Banks would not accept anyone who could only repeat the steps without understanding why. He wanted them to be able to explain how each change worked. That understanding stopped deadly mistakes. Flight Sergeant Thomas Yardley became Banks's best student. Yardley had spent 3 years at Rolls-Royce's Hillington factory near Glasgow before joining the RAF. Banks saw right away that Yardley had a natural feel for thermodynamics. By November 1944, Yardley was doing modifications at RAF Coningsby. He worked with Lancaster squadrons that were starting to get Merlin-powered versions. The changes worked in heavy bombers too, although the gains were smaller. A Lancaster could not simply run away from a fighter no matter what you did to the engines, but the extra power helped it climb better and reach higher ceilings. That made it a little harder to shoot down. Corporal James Dennison set up another branch at RAF White Waltham in Cambridgeshire, focusing only on Mosquito squadrons. Dennison was younger than Banks, only 23, but he understood the lessons fully. His personal contribution was fine-tuning the fuel mix for different mission types. Mosquitoes flying low-level anti-ship strikes needed a different mix than Mosquitoes doing high-altitude photo runs. Dennison worked out those changes. He basically created mission-specific engine setups. The unofficial network worked through very careful control of information. The modifications were never talked about on phones. They were never written in official letters. The knowledge moved face to face, mechanic to mechanic, usually during visits that were officially about normal maintenance. Squadron engineering officers kept believable deniability. They knew something was being done to improve the engines, but the paperwork only showed normal work and adjustments. If someone higher up asked, they could honestly say they did not know the details. This arrangement worked for everyone except the rulebook. Air Ministry engineering rules still said every modification had to go through formal approval, testing, and written record. Banks's network broke all of that. It ran like a shadow system. It made the planes better through channels the system did not admit were real. It only continued because the results were too good to argue with. Mosquito squadrons that used modified engines showed better numbers over and over. More missions completed, fewer combat losses, more successful hits on targets, but the changes had real risks. Banks never lied about that. Engines running at higher boost wore out faster than normal engines. Parts that normally lasted 200 hours between overhauls sometimes needed replacing at 150 hours. Piston crowns wore down faster. Exhaust valves showed more wear. The speed came with a higher maintenance bill. Someone had to pay that cost. Worse, sometimes engines still failed in deadly ways. In December 1944, a Mosquito taking off from Banff had a connecting rod break in the left engine at 400 feet. The rod tore through the crankcase. Oil sprayed onto the hot exhaust pipe. The fire started right away. The crew managed to circle on the remaining engine and land, but the fire destroyed the wing before the ground crew could put it out. The report after the crash showed that the broken engine had been modified 3 weeks earlier. Banks looked at the wreck himself. The broken rod had tiny cracks from being pushed too hard over many flights. The service record said the engine had 178 hours since its last overhaul.
That was normally okay.
But Banks had said modified engines had to be pulled at 150 hours, even if they still looked fine. The fitter in charge had missed that cutoff by 28 hours. Those 28 hours almost killed 2 men. After that, Banks made his network a little more formal. He made a small tracking notebook. Every modified engine got one line in it: the serial number, the date it was changed, the hour limit. He made copies for the fitters he had trained. His rule was clear: pull the engine at the limit, no matter how good it seems. That extra caution brought the failure rate down close to 0 in the next months. But it also meant more work, more engine swaps, more hours in the hangar. Station commanders now had a strange problem. They could not officially approve changes that broke Air Ministry rules, but they also could not afford to lose the speed edge those changes gave. The answer became officially not knowing. Engineering officers were told verbally, make sure engines are kept at the highest possible performance standards. That sentence could mean anything or nothing. It was perfect for them. The cost of all this became impossible to ignore on 14 January 1945, Flight Lieutenant David Wilson and his navigator were 40 minutes into a photo mission over Kiel, when the right-hand Merlin's temperature gauge jumped past safe levels. Wilson pulled the throttle back right away, but the damage was already happening. Oil pressure was falling. Metal temperatures were climbing even though he had reduced power. He turned for home. He tried to nurse the sick engine while the left Merlin did all the work. They almost made it. 8 miles from the English coast, the right engine locked up fully. The propeller just windmilled. Wilson had to ditch in the North Sea. Air-Sea Rescue found them 90 minutes later. They were freezing, but alive. When they took that engine apart, they saw a chain reaction. It started with a cracked exhaust valve. The valve had run too hot because the cylinder had stayed at high boost too often. Tiny cracks grew across the face of the valve over many flights. On that last mission, a piece of the valve face broke off and fell into the cylinder. It smashed the piston crown into pieces. Those pieces tore up the cylinder wall. Metal shavings got into the oil. That dirty oil tore up the bearings in minutes. Banks read the report with the face of someone watching a warning finally come true. He had always known that staying at high power for long periods pushed parts past their design life. The real question was it worth it? Wilson's near-death gave an answer that did not feel good. The math of acceptable loss was ugly. Between June 1944 and March 1945, Mosquitoes with modified engines flew about 3,400 missions. Combat losses were 11 planes. That is a loss rate of 0.32%. Standard Mosquitoes on similar jobs lost 47 planes out of about 6,800 missions. That is a loss rate of 0.69, so the modified planes were about twice as likely to come home. But those same modified engines had 23 mechanical failures bad enough to force emergency landings or ditching. 3 crews died in crashes caused directly by engine failure. Another 7 were injured. This moral math bothered Banks more than he said out loud. Every engine he signed off might save a crew from German fighters, but it also put them in danger from their own machine. The choice was not only his. The pilots asked for the changes.
They knew the trade.
But Banks still felt it. When an engine blew, he knew it was his hand that had turned that screw, chosen that fuel jet, advanced that timing. Squadron engineering officers faced the same choice in their own way. Keep engines at peacetime rules and lose some speed.
Or push hard and accept that sometimes something would explode.
Most chose to push. They said combat kills faster than mechanical trouble. A crew shot down over Germany might die or spend years in a camp. A crew ditching from engine failure usually lived if rescue got to them in time. The North Sea was deadly, yes, but it was not the Gestapo. Rolls-Royce stayed officially unaware of the widespread changes, but their engineers were not foolish. Company field reps who visited RAF stations started to notice that engines sent back for overhaul were showing wear that did not match the official operating limits. They asked questions. The answers they got were careful and vague. The reps sent their suspicions to Derby. Now, senior management had a problem. Their engines were being pushed past spec, apparently with success. If they complained, they might force the RAF to stop. That could make the Mosquito less effective. Some Rolls-Royce engineers were secretly fascinated. The company had rated the Merlin safely. They chose reliability over maximum output. But some of them always guessed there was more room in the design. Banks's changes were like a giant field experiment.
Not in a lab.
In real war, engines were being used at high stress for thousands of hours, and the results were getting written down in service logs. The human cost was not only in the air. Ground crews working on modified engines lived with non-stop pressure. They knew every choice mattered, saying, yes, this engine can fly 1 more mission, or we can delay the overhaul 10 more hours, or that temperature reading is probably fine, could mean life or death for people they knew by name. By early 1945, Flight Sergeant Yardley had developed an ulcer. The stress of being responsible for that much risk was eating him from the inside. Several fitters asked to be moved to non-operational units. They said they could not keep carrying that worry. Banks himself looked worn down. Photos from late 1944 show a man who had aged a lot in 2 years. The confident mechanic who first modified DZ414 had turned into someone who understood that new ideas can save lives but can also kill. He still thought the changes were necessary. The combat numbers proved that. But knowing you are right does not make it feel better when things go wrong. The question of whether to keep going stopped being a question in February 1945. That was when Rolls-Royce's top leader showed up at Marham without warning. Ernest Hives did not announce his visit. He came because he wanted to see the truth, not some cleaned-up version for the bosses. Hives was the managing director of Rolls-Royce's Aero Engine Division. He drove himself to RAF Marham on 12th of February 1945 in a staff car he borrowed from the Air Ministry. He found Banks in Workshop 3. Banks was elbow deep in a Merlin that had 147 hours on it since its last modification. Hives watched quietly for 10 minutes. Then he said, "Show me what you're doing, Sergeant."
All of it. The talk that followed lasted 3 hours.
Banks explained the boost control changes. He showed the fuel jet replacements. He walked Hives through how he chose which engines were safe to modify. He did not beg. He did not defend himself. He just laid out the facts and the combat results. Hives asked careful questions about detonation margins, bearing loads and heat stress. This was not a yelling session. It was two engineers talking about problems most people could not even understand. Hives had brought service records for 200 Merlin engines, picked at random from frontline squadrons. He spread them on a workbench. He divided them by eye into modified and standard, based on wear. The modified engines showed higher wear on some parts, just like Banks had said, but the failure rate still stayed within what Hives would call acceptable, as long as maintenance stayed strict. What surprised Hives most was how steady and repeatable the results were. Banks's work was not random tinkering. It was a real engineering method applied again and again. The Rolls-Royce director asked about failures. Banks gave him the notebook, the simple log of every modified engine. 23 mechanical failures across 3,400 missions, a failure rate of 0.68%. Hives compared that to the standard Merlin's failure rate in the field, which was 0.31%. So yes, the modified engines failed about twice as often. But the planes with them survived combat about twice as often. The end result was fewer dead crews. From a practical point of view, Banks's changes saved lives. What Hives did next surprised everyone there. He did not order Banks to stop. Instead, he thanked him. He thanked him for finding performance margins that Rolls-Royce had been too careful to use. The company had built wide safety factors into the Merlin settings. Now, real war had shown that those safety factors were bigger than they needed to be in some cases. Banks had not discovered something Rolls-Royce engineers had never imagined. He had acted on something they only had on paper. He had done it without waiting for a committee. Within weeks, Rolls-Royce released Technical Service Bulletin 184. Dated 7th March 1945, the bulletin allowed higher boost pressures for Merlin engines in certain uses. It basically made Banks's changes official. The bulletin set rules. Engines had to be fresh from overhaul. They had to run on certified 100-octane fuel. They had to get mandatory checks every 150 hours. The richer fuel mix for high power became standard. The magneto timing did not officially change. Rolls-Royce decided the extra crankshaft stress was still too risky to approve for everyone, but they did not ban it either. The bulletin turned Banks's grey area work into approved procedure. Overnight, what had been technically not allowed became the rule. It also proved that Banks's engineering judgment had been right. Rolls-Royce was not only letting him continue, they were copying him. The effect spread beyond the Mosquito. Late model Spitfires and Mustangs with Merlin engines got similar upgrades. That helped them perform better at high altitude against German jets. The Merlin 100 series engines built for after the war also took lessons from these wartime changes. They had better detonation resistance and could handle higher boost for longer. Banks's touch was in the final form of the Merlin engine, but his name did not appear in the official development notes. His reward came in strange ways. In April 1945, Banks was promoted to warrant officer. That was unusual for someone who was not aircrew. The paperwork said he gave exceptional technical contributions to operational effectiveness. That boring wording hid what he had really done. Several pilots whose lives had been saved by his engines wrote to him in private. Most just shook his hand quietly on visits and said nothing. The best way to say thank you was to come home alive. After the war, Rolls-Royce offered Banks a job in Derby. They wanted him in experimental engine development. There, his style of pushing limits would be seen as useful, not dangerous. He said yes. He left the RAF in September 1945. His service record said he was competent and reliable. That weak phrase missed the point completely. The final mission record was written in June 1945 after Germany surrendered. In the war's last year, Mosquitoes with modified engines had flown 8,200 missions. They lost 27 planes from all causes. That is 0.33%. Standard Mosquitoes in the same time flew 4,100 missions. They lost 31 planes. That is 0.76%. The proof was overwhelming. Banks's work cut combat losses by more than half. That saved about 200 aircrew lives. And it did it with simple mechanical changes that cost almost nothing except careful attention. The Air Ministry never officially said that the modifications were part of why the Mosquito was such a success. Official histories praised the plane's great design. That was true, but not the full story. The Mosquito was brilliant, but Banks made it better. Roderick Banks died in 1992 at age 76 in a suburb of Derby. He had spent 47 years improving engines for Rolls-Royce. His obituary in the Derby Telegraph said he had a distinguished career in aerospace engineering. It did not say anything about mosquitoes or wartime changes. The story might have disappeared forever, except for a chance moment at a Mosquito veterans reunion in 1995. 3 former aircrew, talking to each other, all mentioned Banks's engines. A historian finally asked, "Who is Banks?" The full story came out slowly after that. It was built from maintenance logs, squadron records, and interviews with the ground crew, who were still alive. What became clear was that Banks had done something rare,
Real battlefield innovation from below.
a sergeant who found performance limits that officers and engineers had not used. Military groups say they like initiative, but in real life they are often built to stop exactly what Banks did. He made changes to expensive equipment without permission, using only his own judgment. His success showed an uncomfortable truth about conservative engineering. Rolls-Royce's safety limits made sense for general use, but they were too strict for engines kept at the very highest standard and flown by top crews. Banks understood that safe in all cases is not the same thing as best in this case. The Merlin could safely make more power if you watched all the variables. Perfect maintenance, good fuel, careful monitoring. The blanket rules hid real performance that could have been used. This idea still matters today. Modern aircraft engines also run under careful ratings. Companies protect themselves from blame. They also have to plan for bad fuel, rushed maintenance, and rough handling. Military and airline operators often find that engines can actually do more than the book says, but using that extra power needs exactly what Banks showed.
Deep knowledge.
Careful work. A calm willingness to accept faster wear in exchange for better performance. The changes also showed the difference between engineering in peace and in war. Peace cares about long life, cost control, and wide safety margins that assume someone might do sloppy work. War cares about staying alive today, even if that means the engine wears out faster. Banks understood that an engine that only lasts 150 hours instead of 200 is still worth it if those 150 hours stop a crew from dying on March 47th. Modern fighter jets still deal with that same problem. Fourth and fifth generation fighters have official limits, and in case of survival limits. Pilots know the second set. The F-15's engine, for example, has normal thrust levels and emergency thrust levels. The emergency setting shortens engine life, but it can save the pilot. Banks helped create that way of thinking in his time. He showed that saving lives can be worth using up machines. The Mosquito's post-war legend got a big boost from the performance it had in combat. Speed numbers you see in history books often come from Mosquitoes with Banks's changes, not standard ones. The Mosquito became famous partly because Banks made it faster than de Havilland first built it. That is a historical twist. The plane's famous speed came from field modifications that technically broke the rules. Engineering classes sometimes study Banks's work as an example. It shows the fight between real-world problem-solving and official process. His changes were logical and careful, but outside the system. They make people ask, when should you follow rules and when should you challenge them? There is no easy answer. Banks was right. His changes saved lives. But if he had been wrong and engines had failed much more often, he would have been put on trial for being reckless. The bigger lesson is about where new ideas come from. Big improvements do not always come from design offices or research labs. Sometimes they come from the people in the workshop, the people who are face-to-face with the problem, the people who are not trapped by official thinking. Banks was not smarter than Rolls-Royce's engineers. He was just standing in a different place. He had different pressures. He was willing to accept risks that company engineers could not. His workshop at Marham was knocked down in 1962 during station upgrades. There is no sign there now. You cannot look at a plaque and say, this is where Banks modified DZ414, or this is where he trained the fitters who carried his ideas everywhere. The Mosquito that used his modifications during Operation Jericho made it through the war and was later scrapped in 1947. Its engines, which were part of history, were melted for their aluminum. The physical proof disappeared. Only the paperwork and the memories stayed. And yet, Banks's influence continues in ways he never saw. Modern engine programs now include systems to capture feedback from the field. They are built to listen for ideas like his. Operators report performance margins. Engineers study unapproved changes not just to stop them, but to learn from them. Rolls-Royce's later companies built formal paths for field service reps to report unusual but successful habits. They turned what Banks did in secret into standard practice. The Mosquito's legend lives on because it did things everyone said were impossible. It flew to Berlin and came back. It bombed Gestapo headquarters with deadly accuracy. It outran the Luftwaffe's best fighters for 6 years. That victory belonged to Geoffrey de Havilland's brilliant design, yes, but it also belonged to a mechanic who read the manuals, understood the margins, and decided that saving lives was worth bending rules no one even knew could bend. If you like true war stories about engineering, risk, and people who quietly changed history, make sure you follow and share.